7. The communion cup passed everyone, except me. My husband already knew. There is a cup in my memory that I have never been able to set down. It is not large, it is not ornate. In our district the communion cup was a simple thing, dark wood on the outside, smooth from decades of passing hands, with a plain tin liner that caught the light when the deacon tilted it forward. I had watched that cup move down the rows of women every communion Sunday since I was a small girl sitting beside my mother, too young to receive but old enough to understand that the moment it touched you belonged. You were counted. You were clean before God and clean before the community. I was 23 years old the first time it did not reach me. My husband, Elias, was seated across the aisle with the men, the way our district arranged itself every service. I remember watching him from the corner of my eye the way a wife learns to, without turning her head, without appearing to look. He was calm. His hands were folded, and when the cup reached him, he received it without hesitation, tipped it forward, and passed it to the man beside him. He already knew. I did not understand that for a long time. I told myself many things instead. I told myself the deacon had simply miscounted. I told myself I had shifted in my seat at the wrong moment and been overlooked. I told myself it was an accident so ordinary that no one else had noticed, and that if I sat very still and kept my expression composed, it would be corrected before the service ended. It was not corrected. The cup completed its row without me, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap, feeling something I could not yet name settle over me like the first cold of a season you are not prepared for. That was the autumn of 1991. I have been trying to explain that morning ever since. I grew up in a close district in eastern Ohio, the second daughter of a family that had farmed the same land for 3 generations. My father was a quiet man who expressed love through work, through fields that were always orderly, through a barn roof that never leaked, through the way he rose before anyone else and had the fire built before my mother came downstairs. My mother was gentler in her language, but equally certain in her beliefs. In our household, the church was not separate from daily life. It was the structure that daily life was built inside. Communion Sunday came twice a year. In the weeks before, our district held council meetings, private conversations between members and the bishop, a time for confession, for the settling of disputes, for the examination of conscience. Only masses who had passed council were permitted to receive communion. To be passed over was not a small thing. It meant something had been found wanting, either in your conduct or in your standing before the community. I had never been passed over, not once. In the years since my baptism, I married Elias when I was 20 years old. He was 26, the eldest son of a respected family from a neighboring district, recommended to my father by our bishop, with a warmth that I later understood was not entirely about Elias's character. At the time I saw only that he was settled, that he owned land, that he spoke carefully and did not waste words. I mistook that economy of language for depth. I mistook his steadiness for safety. Our first 2 years of marriage were not unhappy exactly. They were careful. Elias had opinions about how a household should run, about where objects belonged, about the order of tasks on any given day, and he expressed those opinions with such quiet certainty that disagreeing felt less like a choice and more like confusion on my part. I learned to arrange things the way he preferred them. I learned which topics produce silence and which produce the particular look, not anger. Nothing as readable as anger, but a stillness in his face that meant the conversation had ended, whether I was finished or not. I did not think of this as control then. I thought of it as his way, the way every husband had a way, and the way a good wife learned to move within it. The cup was the first thing that showed me the edges of the space I had been given. The communion cup I grew up watching had been in our district for many years. When I joined as a baptized member, one of the older women, a deacon's wife named Ruth, told me the wood of the cup had been cut from a fallen oak on the original Yoder farm, that it had been shaped by hand, that it had been used in every communion service the district had held for as long as she could remember. I do not know if that was exactly true. What I know is that I believed it, and that believing it made the cup feel like a living thing, like something that remembered who had held it. After the service where I was passed over, I found Ruth near the food tables in the fellowship hall. I had composed myself carefully. I asked her, as lightly as I could manage, whether she had noticed anything unusual during the cup's passing. She looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. Then she said the cup had moved as it always did, and she turned back to the bread she was slicing. That pause, I carried it home with me like a stone in my apron pocket. When I mentioned the incident to Elias that evening, I watched his face. There was no surprise in it, no confusion. He said the deacon was an older man and sometimes lost his count, and that if I felt troubled I should speak to the bishop. His voice was even. His eyes stayed on the table. I did not speak to the bishop. I told myself there was nothing certain enough to bring to him, that I would only appear foolish, that the wisest course was to wait for the spring communion and see whether it happened again. It happened again. Spring arrived slowly that year, gray into gray for most of March and into April. The council meetings came and went. I attended mine, sat across from Bishop Schlabach in the spare room off the back of the Yoder house, and answered his questions as I always had. I had not quarreled with my neighbors. I had not violated any teaching I was aware of. I had not spoken against the community or acted in a way that brought shame to my household. The bishop nodded after each answer. Expression was what it always was, patient, closed, giving nothing. "You are well then, Sarah?" he asked at the end. "I am well," I said. He dismissed me. I stepped out into the cold hallway and thought that whatever had happened in the autumn must have been the deacon's error. That the bishop would have said something. If there were a concern, that spring communion would be different. I sat in my place that April Sunday with a steadiness I had worked hard to build. I watched the cup begin its journey. I watched it move from woman to woman, watched each face tip forward slightly, watched the cup return to level before it moved again. When it reached the woman seated 2 places to my left, it paused. The deacon looked up, not at me, past me toward the men's side of the room. Then he moved the cup to the woman on my right. I heard the sound of the wooden bench shifting as my neighbor settled after receiving. I heard the distant sound of a horse outside. I heard my own breathing. I sat with my hands folded in my lap in exactly the posture my mother had taught me, and I felt the same cold settle over me that had come in the autumn, except that this time it carried a question inside it. This was not an accident. I want to tell you that I confronted Elias that evening, that I demanded an answer, that I had the courage to name what I suspected out loud before I fully understood it, but that is not what I did. What I did was set a pot of soup on the stove, cut the bread that needed cutting, and watch my husband across the supper table while he spoke about a fence post that needed replacing and the price of feed, and whether the mast, family's new barn addition, was as large as people were saying. He spoke as though it were any Sunday, as though I had received the cup and nothing had happened. I began, in the weeks that followed, to look at things I had not looked at closely before. I found it odd that Elias had begun attending the bishop's house on Wednesday evenings, not for any meeting I was told about, but for what he described only as counsel. I found it odd that when I asked my mother-in-law, Edna, about a cousin of Elias's who had left the district several years before our marriage, she changed the subject with a speed that felt practiced. I found it odd that a letter arrived for Elias one morning, hand-addressed, the return district not one I recognized, and that he placed it directly in his coat pocket without opening it at the table, the way he opened every other piece of mail. I noticed the letter, I noticed the pocket, and I noticed that by the time I folded the laundry 3 days later, the letter was gone, the cup was a locked room, and the letter, I was beginning to believe, was a key. In our district, there were circumstances under which a member could be kept from communion without a formal announcement. The bishop had the authority to instruct a deacon privately. It was used, as far as I knew, in cases of serious uncorrected sin or unresolved discipline, situations the community was not yet required to know about in full. It was meant to be temporary, a prompt to confession and correction, a private pressure before a public one. To trigger that process, the bishop needed a complaint from within the household. I understood this the night I found the cup, not the district's cup, a different one, in the back of the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, beneath the wind quilts I had not pulled out since the cold broke. I found a small ceramic cup, plain white, the kind used for measuring. Inside it was a folded piece of paper, and inside the paper was a short note in Elias's handwriting. It was a list, dated the previous August, 4 items, my name at the top, then below it in his careful level script, 4 things he had reported to Bishop Schlabach as concerns about my conduct. I had spoken to a woman who left the district. This was true. She was a childhood friend. We had spoken briefly at a market in town, and I had not told Elias because I had not thought it required telling. I had questioned the bishop's ruling on a matter regarding my brother's family. This was true in the way that a private thought expressed once to my husband at our kitchen table could be called questioning. I had failed in my household duties on a repeated basis. I read this sentence 3 times. I could not match it to anything that had actually occurred. The fourth item I will not repeat here. It concerned something private between a husband and wife, and it was worded in such a way that I could not recognize my own life inside it. I stood in the cold bedroom holding that piece of paper until my legs began to ache. Then I folded it exactly as I had found it, placed it back inside the cup, placed the cup back beneath the quilts, and closed the cedar chest. I did not sleep, but I did not leave the room either. I lay in the dark beside my husband, and I listened to him breathe with the complete, the unbothered rhythm of a man who has arranged his world and finds it orderly. I want to explain why I did not act immediately. I think some people, hearing this, will find it difficult to understand. But inside the community where I was raised, the bishop's authority was not a matter of opinion or preference. His judgment was understood as the channel through which the community maintained integrity before God. To challenge it, especially as a woman, especially as a wife, was not simply difficult, it was nearly unthinkable. The entire structure of belonging, of identity, of family connection, depended on remaining inside the community's trust. And I was afraid of what Elias would do if he knew I had found the list. I spent the summer watching. I watched Elias, the small arrangements of his day, the evenings he spent away. I watched Bishop Schlabach at Sunday services, the direction of his gaze, the brief conversations that stopped when I drew near. I watched Edna, my mother-in-law, who brought food to our house every other week with a warmth that felt, that summer, like the warmth of someone visiting a person who does not know they are ill. In August, I did something I had not done since before my marriage. I wrote a letter to my mother. I did not explain everything. I asked whether she had heard any concerns expressed about me before my marriage, not from Elias's family but from anyone. I asked whether the match had been agreed upon in any way beyond the usual introductions. Her reply came 2 weeks later, and it was 3 sentences long. She hoped I was well. She said the summer had been dry. She said she was sure whatever I was worried about would resolve itself if I prayed faithfully and submitted to my husband's guidance. She knew something. The brevity of that letter, from a woman who normally filled every page she was given, told me so. By the time the autumn communion came again, I had been passed over 4 times across 2 years. 4 times I had sat in my place and watched the cup travel the row without stopping at me. 4 times I had folded my hands and composed my face and walked out into the fellowship hour as though nothing had occurred. That 5th autumn, something in me had changed. I do not know exactly when it changed. I think it was gradual, the way a fence post loosens in the ground, not one storm but many seasons. The slow work of water and ice until one morning you lean against it and feel it give. I spoke to an older woman in the district named Miriam, who had been widowed years before, and who lived at the edge of the community with the particular freedom that widowhood and age sometimes granted the woman who had already paid every price asked of her. I had always found her unsettling in a way I now understand was actually respect. I sat at her kitchen table one afternoon while Elias was away on a neighbor's farm, and I told her what I had found in the cedar chest. Miriam listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. The kettle on her stove began to whistle and she did not move to take it off, just let it sound until it spent itself. "Did you know," she said finally, "that Elias was engaged before you?" I did not know. The girl left the district. Her name was Hannah. She was passed over in communion for 3 seasons before she left. The room became very still. "He reported her too?" I asked. "Her family believes so," Miriam said. "Nothing was ever confirmed." I thought about the cousin no one discussed. I thought about the letter with the unfamiliar return address, the one Elias had put directly in his pocket. Why would a man do that? I asked, though I think I already understood. Miriam looked at me the way old women look at younger ones when they are deciding how honest to be. "Because a woman who cannot take communion cannot vote in members' meetings," she said. "Cannot challenge a household decision brought before the church. Cannot stand as a witness in any matter before the bishop." She let me carry that for a moment. "A woman who cannot take communion," she continued, "has no formal standing. She is present in the community but not counted by it." I went home that afternoon and I stood in my kitchen for a long time before I began supper. I stood in the same kitchen, where I had learned to arrange things the way Elias preferred them, where I had learned which subjects ended a conversation, where I had served meals and folded laundry, and convinced myself that a careful life and a free life were the same thing. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. The autumn communion was 3 weeks away. I spent those 3 weeks doing something I had not done in years, I thought clearly. I moved through my days with the same external rhythm: the meals, the cleaning, the Sunday service, the Wednesday Bible reading. And underneath that surface I was doing the quiet, irreversible work of deciding. I wrote out what I knew. I wrote it in the back of a recipe book I kept on the kitchen shelf, in a hand small enough to be mistaken for measurement notes, dates. The 4 items on Elias's list, what Miriam had told me, what my mother's short letter had implied, what I now understood about the machinery of what had been done to me. 2 days before the communion service, I went to see Bishop Schlabach. I had not told Elias I was going. I walked the 2 miles to the bishop's house in the early morning, before Elias was awake, carrying my recipe book in my apron pocket. The bishop answered the door himself. He looked at me with the same patient, closed expression he always wore, and I thought for a moment he would simply send me away. I said, "I would like to discuss the complaint that was filed against me." The pause that followed was not long, but it was complete. It was the pause of a man encountering something he had believed would never arrive. He let me in. I will not detail everything that was said in that room. What I will tell you is that the bishop did not deny the complaint existed. He spoke of pastoral discretion and the protection of the household. He spoke of a husband's responsibility. He said that my situation would be reviewed before the service. I placed my recipe book on his table. I opened it to the back pages. I asked him to read the dates. The bishop read them. His face did not change. Something behind his face did. Some arrangement of certainty that had been in place for a long time shifted slightly. The process, I said, was not used for pastoral correction. It was used to remove my standing. He was quiet. I would like it restored before Sunday, I said. I walked home in the early light with the recipe book in my apron pocket and my hands entirely still at my sides. I cannot tell you that what happened next was swift or simple. It was not. The conversation between the bishop and Elias, whatever it contained, was not one I was present for. I know it happened because Elias came to supper that night with the particular stillness of a man whose arrangements have been disturbed, and he barely spoke, and he did not look at me the way he usually did, the assessing, confirming look that I had learned to accept as part of living in that house. On Communion Sunday I sat in my place. I folded my hands. I watched the cup begin its journey. When it reached me, the deacon did not look past me. He tilted the cup forward, and I received it. And I passed it to the woman on my right. The wood was smooth from decades of hands. The cup was lighter than I had expected. After all the weight I had been carrying it with in my memory, I did not cry. I sat with a straight back and a composed face, and I felt something settle. Not relief, not triumph, not joy. Something quieter than all of those. The particular feeling of a person who has finally stood in a place they were told they did not belong and found the ground solid beneath them. Elias and I did not remain married for many more years after that. The arrangement had depended on my not knowing what it was. Once I knew, once I had walked to the bishop's house in the early morning and named what had been done, the architecture of it could not hold. We separated before I turned 30. The district handled it with the careful management that communities apply to things they would prefer not to. Examined directly, I was not shunned. I was in the particular language of that place, released. I left Ohio the year I turned 31. I have not returned to that district. My mother and I exchanged letters for several years before she died. Letters that were careful, that circled the things neither of us said directly, that nonetheless contained a love I could not question even when I did not understand her. Choices. I later learned that Elias remarried within 2 years of our separation. I learned this through a cousin who kept in touch. I did not learn what became of his second wife's communion status. I think about that sometimes. I think about Hannah, whose name I was never supposed to know. I think about Miriam, who told me the truth over a kettleful of whistling steam on a quiet afternoon. I am 56 years old now. I live plainly, though not in the way I was raised. I do not attend a church with a communion service. I have not held a wooden cup in many years, but I know what I learned from the one that passed me over. I learned that exclusion dressed in ceremony is still exclusion. I learned that a man who controls what a woman is permitted to be seen as before her community, before her God, is not protecting her. I learned that silence maintained out of fear is not the same as peace. And that I asked quietly in the right room can be more powerful than any public accusation. I kept the recipe book. It sits on my kitchen shelf now, in a house that is arranged the way I prefer. I open it sometimes, not to the back pages. I have no need of those anymore. I open it to a biscuit recipe my mother taught me when I was 7 years old, pressed flat from the fold. The handwriting hers, before everything, before I understood what it would cost me to know what I know. That is the recipe I use.